Hello, everyone, and welcome to Africa Fire Mission's weekly virtual training session. My name is Mike, and I'm the Programs Director at Africa Fire Mission. We're so happy that you took time out of your busy schedules to join us for today's training session. Today, we're joined by Helen Underhill, and she's going to be doing a really interesting presentation about risk reduction in humanitarian settlements and things like that. I think you guys are in for a great session today. Before we get started, just want to touch on a couple of administrative items. If you stick around for at least 70% of today's training, which is usually about 40 or 45 minutes, you will receive a certificate of attendance for today's training. If you get cut off or you can't make it for the whole time, keep an eye in the chat. We are going to post a link to our Google Drive where you'll be able to find a recording of today's session as well as all the other sessions that we've done so far this year. If you follow that link, watch a recording of one of our classes and answer a few questions about what you learned, I can get you a certificate of attendance for that class as well. Before we get started today, I'm going to pass things over to Jose Nanjiri. Jose is Africa Fire Mission's Fire Safety Officer. He's going to get us started with a few words of encouragement.
Thanks, Mike. I truly appreciate you for always being here. And to our guest, thank you so much, Helen, for joining us. I'm really excited for today's session, especially that this particular topic is really, really close to my heart. So I really want to hear your perspective and also what you have for us. So today, I've just been really, not even today, this week, my heart has really been heavy, especially with the news of one of our firefighters passed on. Mr. Lloyd. Mr. Lloyd was there as assistant fire chief, or the Mike. Who was he? The assistant fire chief?
He was the lead firefighter, the acting fire chief.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for that. Thank you for that correction. Lead firefighter at Mzuzu Fire Station. And to be honest, I must be honest with all of us. I tried to look for something to encourage us. I couldn't find because my heart was heavy. So I decided, let me write a letter for all firefighters in Africa, because that letter actually highlights the shared bond. It appreciates us and shows support for us firefighters in Africa, while acknowledging the unique challenges we face here in Africa. We are not so privileged to have so many equipment as other countries or nations. But here's a letter. Allow me to read. To all brave firefighters across Africa, I want to take a moment to recognize and thank each one of you for your incredible courage, dedication, and resilience. Every day, you put your lives on the line to protect others, often with limited resources and in the face of great danger. You are the unsung heroes of our communities, embodying the true spirit of service and sacrifice. That does not go unnoticed. You save lives, protect property, and offer hope in moments of despair. Every fire you put out, every life you rescue makes a profound difference. Even in the toughest of times, when the challenges seem overwhelming, remember that your efforts are not in vain. And the part of brotherhood and sisterhood that stretches across this continent and beyond, a community of people bound of bravery and compassion. Stay strong, stay safe, and continue to inspire. I am grateful for you, and we stand with you in solidarity. With deepest and respect and gratitude from me, Jose Ngonjiri. Thank you so much. Back to you, Chief Mike.
Thank you very much, Jose. We always appreciate you sharing those words of encouragement and all your efforts to try to promote the fire service throughout all of Africa. It's much appreciated. At the conclusion of our time today, at the top of the hour, we'll switch over to our tea time. Jose will host a tea time. It's a time where you could ask some more questions about today's lesson or discuss anything that's on your mind. It's a great time to network with fellow firefighters throughout Africa. So if you've got the time and the bundles, I would encourage you to stick around for that as well. At this point in time, I'm going to pass things over to Helen to get us started with our training. Welcome, Helen, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. Can I just check that you can see the right screen?
Yes.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm so grateful to be here today. And I just want to say thanks to Mike and Jose for inviting me and to continue some of the conversations that I have had with Nancy over the years. And to present some of our work at Kindling, which I'll tell you about in a little minute, about fire safety and the work that we've been doing to improve fire safety in the humanitarian sector. I am based in the UK. I get a bit overexcited. I was a teacher, I was an educator myself, but if I talk too fast, I will try sometimes to hold myself back. So if there are any questions, please do put them in the chat. I've got a moment halfway through where we'll pause, and it would be really lovely to hear from you as we go through the session. In terms of what we're going to cover, so I'll just give you a very brief introduction to Kindling and the fire incidents in the humanitarian settings, so how we've ended up coming about. I'll introduce the state of fire safety in the Humanitarian Shelter and Settlements project, the research that we did. Don't be afraid of that word. I'm sure many of you will have seen it before, socio-technical fire safety. It just basically we're saying that there's a technical aspect of fire safety, but there's also those technical things are informed and shaped by social factors, the people that are actually at the heart of fire safety. I'm going to give you an introduction to some of the fire experiments that we've been doing. And you'll be the first people to actually see some of the imagery of some of those experiments, and then there should be time for questions and discussion. My email there is there if you've got any. I try not to use fire puns, but if you've got any burning questions, please feel free to get in touch. So Kindling, who are we? Well, our tagline is fire safety for all. So we try to connect fire safety knowledge to local and global humanitarian and urban development efforts to reduce the unequal impact of fire on people, property, and livelihoods in vulnerable, marginalized communities around the world. So we have work going on at the moment in Cape Town. We've been working in Bangladesh. We also do work around homelessness in the US, for example. So there's a lot going on, and as we're rethinking that mission statement, the most important idea is that fire safety for all. How do we do it? Well, we work to try and create impact. So to make sure that we don't just do research for research's sake, it's got to have a real world impact. We try to be collaborative. We aim to be agile and respond to how things change, and to look at social justice issues in fire safety as well. So we want to explore, we want to be open, we want to collaborate. In terms of why Kindling exists, I'm sure for many of you this won't come as a surprise, but 95% of fire deaths occur in low and middle income countries. And it's actually 6 times higher than high income countries, which should be quite alarming to people. In this slide, you can see the world by income, and the World Bank's classification system. Low income countries are in dark blue. There are 2 classifications for middle income countries, and that's the light blue and light pink. Now, Kindling exists to try and understand why there is such a disparity, why it's so unequal. And some of what we'll talk about today will highlight that we see fire safety as a systemic issue. Fire safety should not be a responsibility or burden that should be placed on residents, communities, or solely on firefighters. We want to understand the story of fire and fire risk from different contexts and the systems around it to improve fire safety for all. I'm going to talk now about the humanitarian sector and what we mean by that. So we try to understand how fire risk in the urban environment often happens as an it's unintentional kind of aspect and result of development. Because fire safety isn't well integrated into disaster risk management, into urban planning, electrification programs, for example. And we basically see that fires come out of not thinking about fire safety within the different parts of a system. In the humanitarian sector, we provide support to places that are affected by conflict and disasters. And in both of those areas, we think about fire safety as a socio-technical issue. So we know that some of the unsafe conditions they are social, political, and economic. And that's why some people or communities are more unsafe than others. In the work, in order to try and bring all those different elements together, we try to work with governments, academia, private sector, non-profit sector, and with communities and residents themselves. Now, the humanitarian sector is really, really interesting because there are so many different types of settings. In this image on the left, you'll see that if we're talking about people who have been displaced from one place to the next, many of those people will go to live in that grey box that you see on the left-hand side, amongst what the humanitarian sector calls the host population. We have camp and camp-like settings. So this is the different places that the humanitarian sector will set up. And that's like the image on the right, the bottom of the right-hand picture that you can see there. Those planned camps, and this is an image that I took in Lebanon. Within the camp and camp-like settings, you have all different types of settings as well. So you have reception centres, evacuation centres, collective centres. And as we see with conflicts like in Ukraine, and they're moving into collective centres, unlike ones that we might have seen previously, for example, in underground shelters. We also see transit sites where people are waiting to be, and I hate the word, but to have their kind of applications processed. We also have self-settled informal settlements. These are taking lots of different shapes now. I was recently in a meeting where we had some feedback from the situation in Gaza, and those self-settled informal settlements in Gaza will include everything from underneath bridges to underneath lorries that have been burnt out, and people will create shelters there. We also have the planned camp, so where an agency gets access to a site, and that becomes the place where they create a settlement. On the top picture, this is actually another one. This is an outside camp, but it's kind of rented in some subsidized housing. And this is one of the largest Palestinian camps in Lebanon as well. This is actually in Beirut. So you also have people that will live in subsidized housing, which is often really poor quality. And you have people living with host families as well. Now, I'm going to show a screen now, and I would love to get your input as we work through some images to get your sense of the fire safety challenges that exist in these settings. So if you're able, it would be really wonderful to have a look at the QR code. If that's not possible, because I understand a lot of people will be on the phone, we can just use the chat. So Jose, Mike, do you have a view on whether we should go with this online thing, or whether we should just go with the chat? I'm happy with the chat function.
Probably the chat would be best, I would guess.
Okay, so I'm going to show you a series of images. And what I would love to get from everybody on the call is to just write in the chat what you see as some of the fire safety challenges. And these are all images taken from different contexts, different settings within the humanitarian sector. So, and also if you prefer to put your hand up, I love that as well. Very happy to hear your voices. So straight away, one of the reasons that the two top left images that you see, those were taken by some of my research participants as they were talking about the different ways that fires ignite. So you know, having plastic lining on the inside of a shelter is a fire challenge. So it'd be great if you, as I move through some of the images, if people would put into the chat any fire safety challenges that you see in some of these images. If anyone's brave enough to speak, that would be wonderful. So thank you, Edwin. You get the woo 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 because you were first one. Naked wires, absolutely. So electricity is a huge issue, and it will be an issue that obviously you'll be thinking about all the time in your work. In the humanitarian sector, we have the issue of, and I know it exists in informal settlements, the kind of illegal use of generators or connecting or tapping and therefore leading to overloaded electricity systems. It's a massive problem. So thank you, Edwin. Any other fire safety challenges that people can see in any of these images?
Guys can unmute and give an answer if you'd like.
So just to give people some kind of prompts, then we've got on the top right hand side, obviously it's a massive, we're thinking about evacuation when we look at the buildings. I was running a session with a group of women who were very concerned in Lebanon, who were very concerned about the fact that they were living in the top floor, 4 stories high, and there was no evacuation route, and how would they escape? When you also have fabric running on the outside of the building, that presents a fire safety challenge for the people living there, and also for firefighters and people responding to fires. We have on the bottom right, we've got, this is a planned camp in Lebanon. You've got a densely packed settlement. Fire breaks are difficult. We also have the tires on top of the roof. Thank you, Zachariah. A whoop whoop to you for your contribution. Thank you. We've got densely populated areas with tuk-tuk. So how are the fire services supposed to get through and respond to a fire when the roads are so congested? It's really challenging. In this picture with the tires are obviously very heavy. They burn very, very hot, and that means that they can burn through and actually trap people underneath. The materials that the shelters are made out of, obviously a huge problem. On the bottom left-hand side, we have huge amounts of vegetation. This is in Bangladesh. and the bamboo roofs with tarpaulin, then and then another. We've basically got a lot of fuel. I will show you some more images. These are self-settled camps that happened, that popped up very quickly after the Morocco earthquake. Lots of different types of shelters, tarpaulin, different types of material. And also, if you look at that bottom left-hand picture, think about responding to a fire in that environment. How a firefighter is supposed to be able to support in that environment, getting up the hillside, mountains, where's the access to water? So the humanitarian sector and people trying to support the sector, that's obviously huge challenges for them. A significant issue, again, that many of you will have come across is the storing of rubbish and waste, the combustible materials around the outside of a shelter not only prevents evacuation, but it also prevents access. It prevents access because the fire spread so much more quickly. The different types of materials you can see there. The electrical cabling, bare wires, the actual the way that the shelters are actually built, the construction, huge amounts of issues there. And here we have two images from Beirut. So again, this is the urban environment, the cables. And this is an area that is not maintained at all by the government. So we see huge amounts of cabling and exposed electrical wire with poor quality buildings. Again, we're thinking about evacuation and access, thinking about fire spread. And then in that left-hand image, what you have is the water pipes actually entwined in all the electricity pipes as well, the electricity wires as well. And in that area, the response was actually to have firefighter from the community who went around on a motorbike or like on a moped, because there was absolutely no way that any fire services could get access. So some examples of fire that caught the attention of the humanitarian sector. Before I go on, would anybody like to ask any questions or comment? Is there anything in the chat before I go on?
You can add your questions, your comments in the chat. You can use the raise hand feature. You can unmute yourself. Feel free to participate as you wish.
So please feel free to put any questions in if you want. So I'm just going to highlight a few of the incidents that caught the attention of the humanitarian sector and that really showed some of the big donors, the big governments around the world, that actually there's an urgent need to address the problem. We have to remember that in these environments, these are people who have, for the most part, already been displaced by disaster, war, or conflict many times. One of the communities that I did some work with in Lebanon, these were people who'd already been displaced 3 times, twice within Syria, then once from Syria to Lebanon, and then they lost everything again in a fire. And when you think about that repeated trauma, fire safety is most definitely a social issue that is felt by humans. And these quotations kind of highlight that. One of the Yazidi women who was affected by a fire in 2021 commented that today was worse than 3rd of August 2014 when ISIS attacked them. So in one fire, 290 tents, 130 families displaced and injured 35 people. The images here are of Bangladesh, and in Borneo, in Nigeria, and in Greece, in Lesbos. Now, fires like this frequently harm displaced people. They undermine humanitarian assistance, but most of them don't make international headlines. Some of the better known fires are shown here on the screen, but ultimately, fire safety is a matter of accountability and protection to affected populations. Within the humanitarian sector, there is a mandate to support and protect those people. And by not including fire safety, we argue that we're actually letting those people down. I'm not going to show that video now because it's I can already see we're racing away with time. And so I just want to give you a little bit of an introduction to the research that we did. The current state of fire safety in humanitarian shelter and settlements was not thought about. It was not addressed. It was, I would argue, pretty much ignored. So we were looking at what was being done, what was known, what was not known, and what might be possible. We talked with firefighters, fire engineers, scientists, disaster risk reduction specialists, donors, funders, academics. We looked at focus groups, individual and paired interviews, and we did a literature review as well. Basically, none of this work had ever been done before. And before the sector was trying to move forward, it was important to establish where is the current practice. So if we take, for example, the issue of density, very relevant for thinking about informal settlements. I know many of you will come across the issue of density in your work and the fact that there is not enough space and too many homes. It's not just an issue of how fire spreads, though, because it connects to things like evacuation and, from a social perspective, things like security. When you have locking doors, barring exits, people do it in order to improve security, but we know that actually it can prevent fire egress as well. So we have to think about, are fire breaks enough? Is it appropriate? Is it even possible? If you change if one of the solutions is to change where people cook into a communal cooking area, for example, that's not always appropriate, because for many women and girls, they feel really unsafe not being able to cook in their actual home, in their shelter. So the solutions that are put forward need to take into account how people actually live and people's culture and the concerns that they have as well. Also, in the humanitarian sector, things change very, very quickly. One of our participants said 5 days later, one of these humanitarian shelters, settlements could be completely different. You design one thing and then you come back 5 days later and it's very, very different. So that means the fire safety needs to be thought about throughout the entire life cycle of a settlement. Okay, so if I asked you who has responsibility for fire safety in a humanitarian situation, it's a very difficult question to ask. In our research, we found that everybody said it's everyone's responsibility and therefore no one's. So it sits beyond any one area of responsibility, and that creates huge problems. What that looks like in practice is that when you're setting up a camp from the beginning, you could, so start at the bottom point of that arrow, you could think about fire safety in a needs assessment. But if the person doing the needs assessment doesn't, the idea of fire safety, it then goes up to the person doing the shelter and settlements plan. And if that person decides, I don't know enough about fire safety, it goes up to the site selection person, who might also not think about it. The site planner thinks somebody else will deal with that. the site designer, the person responsible for procurement. Before you know it, you've ended up with a situation where fire safety has been completely unmanaged. Nobody has taken responsibility. And that's one of the biggest problems that we're finding in the sector. And in terms of how we think about that as a whole system, we're thinking about how fire safety relates to houses, to business, to healthcare, communications, pathways, energy, water, the fire services, roads, waste, supply chains, daily tasks. So fire safety in humanitarian sector is incredibly challenging. And these are just some of the systems that we think could be used and could be thought about much more carefully to support fire safety responses, fire prevention activities, if we were to actually start thinking about this really carefully. Before I go on, please do put any comments in the chat if you would like to, or any questions. In terms of how we are approaching this and what we argue is that there are lots of ways that the sector could be responding. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you might be surprised to know that the sector currently does not have any standard way to report a fire incident. There's no standardized process. There is no standardized process for fire risk assessment. There is no standardized process to report any kind of fire safety issues. So if you're somebody that's working in a settlement and you see some really big fire safety issues, there's no standard that says this is what you should do with that information. So we're arguing for more collaboration to include people with different types of knowledge around fire safety within the sector as well. There's a QR code there if you want to have a look at some of the guidance that we've produced. And I'm going to give you a very, very, very brief introduction to some of the things that we talk about. Before we go on, please do, if there's any questions, because I realise I've been talking for a very long time. Okay, so one of the things in the fire risk reduction guidance that many of you might actually be interested in is we have a chapter on fire safety engineering. And we believe that everybody working within the sector should have a basic understanding of fire engineering, basically the principles of ignition, of combustibility. We talk about lots of those key terms. It currently doesn't exist at all. And we believe that there should be a baseline of knowledge expected around fire for the people that actually work in the sector. Through the work that we've done, we argue for this, what we call a holistic approach that recognizes that people have knowledge because they've experienced a fire. People have knowledge because they have the technical knowledge, the physical sciences and engineering knowledge. People will have knowledge of operations, how to incident command, for example, how to create evacuation plans, how to respond to different types of fire. That knowledge is not being used enough within the humanitarian sector. And there's also a knowledge of contexts. Everybody on this call will be the most valuable place of knowledge about your context. But there are also people within the communities that you work that will also know the context. And this comes out in a lot of our research from around the world, that once you can get that collaboration, things can start to, fire safety can start to improve. We also think about fire safety from a before, during, and after, but also recognizing that after the fire, so when we're thinking about response and recovery, it's also the phase before the next fire, because unfortunately, where there are people, there will always be fire. And many of these incidences, they will just keep on happening if we don't work on things like prevention. Okay, so there are 9 areas of guidance. I'm going to try and be really, really brief. The first thing is the socio-technical context. So this gentleman in the middle, this settlement was incredibly lucky because they happened to have a community leader within their settlement who was an electrician. So the context for that settlement was much more fire safe because every week he used to go around and check wires. And so are there, and then he also installed these, the kind of background in order to protect the cooking area from wind and from being right next to combustible materials. So there's a lot within the social context, but we also know that there's a lot within the political context. In many humanitarian situations, we can't do some of the things that could make people safer because of the political status of the people living in that environment. For example, if you do something that makes a structure or settlement appear too permanent, you're going to anger the local, the host population. Or they're not entitled to that kind of thing because of the legalities of how they live. We also see that people are isolated or excluded from conversations about fire safety because of their gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, lots of different complex reasons that social and technical things need to come together. We're also thinking about the environment, seasonality, winter. In the humanitarian sector, we talk about winterization programs because a lot of the environments have very, very hot summers and very, very snowy winters in the same environment. And the average person might arrive in a settlement and expect, they would have been expected to stay there for around 2 years, and now many are there for 15 years. Without the equipment that they've got actually changing. There are different types of settlements. There's a different relationship to fire. We need to think about disability, about the different expectations and burdens placed on people in their daily life as well. So the socio-technical context is huge. Our guidance document also talks about, sorry, it's skipped over fire safety education, where we want people to think about being much more inclusive and much more about what communities know. You can see on the left-hand side, this was a game that I devised that we did in one of the settlements for children to not just be told what they should do, to not just be told, don't do that and do that, but to learn about the dynamics of fire. So each of those coloured cards would either fuel that fire monster, it would make it grow, or it could kill the fire monster. And this engaged the young people and also many of the parents that happened to come in during the session. There is an expectation that fire safety is delivered by the expert, but that often means that in our work, we see that tends to be delivered to men, all through posters. Now, the trouble is that when you only put if you only give knowledge to men and men leave the settlement during the day, you're leaving women and children without any of that knowledge. We're also trying to think about the treatment of burns and challenge some of those misconceptions. For example, the use of toothpaste is still really widespread. So we're trying to think about how we can work with public health teams, for example, to just promote the use of water, cold water for 20 minutes. That's it. Prevention activities, there's so much that we can do, and we're trying to think, and in our guidance documentation, there's lots of stuff around ignition, cooking, heating, lighting, individual habits and practices around games and talking with children. And we just need to remember that things change very quickly. We've also got some guidance about detection and warning. So these need to be culturally specific. We need to think about, for example, who gives out, do you have like a watch system? Who's going to give the warning? Is it all going to go through one person? What type of system? Is it a whistle, a bell? What are the ways that communities get involved in detection and warning in order to support the next thing, evacuation? So do people, for example, practice evacuation? I'm really looking forward to talking with Jose more about this. It's something that gets raised a lot in our work in the humanitarian sector around evacuation modelling. And in some instances, you know, we've got cases where the actual settlement will be surrounded by fences. How can you evacuate when people are in a locked fence? These types of things need to be raised as an issue of fire safety that is actually about life safety. So involving different members of the community, different people within the settlement to talk about evacuation, thinking about how you would practice it, who would practice it, how do you do that in areas where they've experienced a significant fire, and how do you do it in areas where there hasn't been. We've got guidance there about how to minimize the growth of fire. So that's everything from within the actual shelter itself, how you store materials, where materials are, how and where they're stored, the way that the buildings and shelters are constructed. There's a lot within our guidance around that. And then I know this will be the area that probably most of you would be most interested in, is we have stuff within our guidance about firefighting, search and rescue. So the response element. And there's an image there on the right-hand side that shows one of the socio-technical issues associated with fire extinguishers. There was a big program of delivering fire extinguishers, but what wasn't recognized is that there are social dynamics within the community that meant that those fire extinguishers are often removed and stored within one household, and the fire extinguisher was never seen again. So there's an issue of kind of power and relationships within a community where the emphasis is on giving out fire extinguishers. If that's the emphasis of the program, there's real problems that might not be understood until you think about the social dynamics of giving out equipment. And then these are some of the issues we see in some instances. For firefighters, there's the issue of how do you identify where the actual settlement is. In Lebanon, for example, one of the things they introduced was a series of P codes so that they could narrow down the location of where the different shelters were, because getting access was really, really challenging. And also then looking at fire investigations as well. And using the kind of firefighter knowledge of the local context, trying to build those connections between firefighting, search and rescue teams with local residents so that people can understand, for example, how challenging a role it is for a firefighter to respond in an area where it might be really sensitive, where they might experience violence or the unrest because the population there has felt really ignored for so long. And the fire service turn up and they're the first people that have actually arrived, and they're kind of like they get the full force of people's frustrations. So that's those documents, and I'll show a link at the end. There is lots in there that I believe that could support people working in informal settlements. And I've seen that There's a Edwin. I will definitely I will send those links to you in terms of the camp work as well. So there'll definitely be guidance for you within those documents, and we can have a conversation if you want. I'm going to very briefly now just tell you about some of our technical research, probably about 4 minutes left, and then I'll open up to any discussions or questions. So you're going to see now footage. These images are from our work in South Africa, a program of fire experiments that we are doing to support the humanitarian sector in understanding the different materials and the contribution to fire spread. And this is just one, just to give you an introduction, this is just one piece of footage that shows you what a day looked like at the fire experiment site. Okay, so I should say that the information that I'm going to share with you now, I am not the technical person in our team. I'm the social scientist, educator, and I come at it from those perspectives. So I'm relaying information from a presentation by my colleague Sam Stevens, who did his PhD looking at fires in informal settlements in Cape Town, and also analysed some of the incidents in Nairobi as well. So this work is funded to try and understand the physical side of fire and the technical aspects of fire, thinking about the physical principles, but trying to understand how the different materials impact the way that fire works and the dynamics. So you can see in that image that this was a test that was looking at how thatch buildings burn. And on the next slide, you'll be able to see 2 of the images. It was quite alarming seeing and feeling the different levels of heat that came off different types of shelters. So we know that there are lots of differences between contexts, that there's difference in materiality, the weather conditions, the topography, many different physical factors that can affect a fire on a large scale. And we're also trying to understand what that might mean for the actual physics of how the materials contribute to fire spread. So you can see what we've got here is the mock-up of a home, and this one is made out of thatch. It was set on fire, so it was filled with fuel, set on fire, and all of those cones around the outside measure it from different angles with different instrumentation. It looks at the gas flow speeds through heat fluxes, that's the technical name. And that measures the thermal exposure to the environment in different locations. So how the home burns and how it might expose the environment around it. And that might be people or other homes. It might be vegetation, depending where the home is. And that will then affect how the fire spreads. Now, really interestingly, the thatch building was so hot that we all had to stand 10 times further away to observe the fire than on the timber building. The way that it burned, there were giant clumps that kind of fell off. And this is going to provide really important information about what we need to think about in terms of the physics of fire spread for different types of materials. So they also tested mud, tarpaulin, timber, bamboo, some small scale tests on the different types of tarpaulin. And in that big, just if you're looking at those big foil things, you're thinking, what is that? Those are measuring the pressure difference which tells the technical team the velocity of the gas that's coming outside, and those big plumes of flame. It's basically telling the velocity of that the plumes of flame that you see there. So it was I admit that I'm always the skeptic that says, okay, so you're going to set these things on fire, well, so what? But really getting to understand the difference in the heat, the different ways that that smoke plume happened, the intensity, how slow it was at the start, and then the intensity. That is something that will help us. It is something that will help us to think about the way that we talk about fire spread. So somebody has said, please reposition the presentation. I'm not sure whether that means you can't see the slides. I don't know, Mike, if you could help there.
I'm not sure. It looks the same.
Okay. All right. Okay, so just a little bit of statistics and then we will be finished. So what is the fire problem? Well, fundamentally, there you see on the top left hand, this was in Cape Town. At the top, that was before a massive fire, and on the bottom one, this is the result of one particular fire. So in Cape Town, they looked at some of the data. There was 1,612 fires with 11,279 homes destroyed. And that was across a 6-year period. So on average, each fire would destroy about 7 homes. However, what they found is that this image, or these images, show 1,200 fires, homes destroyed in one fire. So that actually the largest 2% of fires were responsible for the 50% of the total homes lost. In other words, 98% of fires are responsible for 58% of homes being lost. This means that in 2/3 of the fires, they do not spread past the first home. So actually what we've got is a problem of ignition and a problem of fire spread. In camps and camp-like settings, we have to think about the problem that recognizes that in those statistics, we have lives lost, injury, trauma, the loss of property, and the interruption to education and livelihoods. So in order to apply the guidance, and I'm going to show the link again for you, you need to understand that the problem is not just a physical one. It's not just about physics and engineering. We need to understand what are our fire safety goals. Is it about protection of property? Is it about protecting life? How many lives? This was a really interesting conversation that we had in Cape Town when we were talking about this issue. What does a successful response look like? We must think about any guidance being related to the context and being appropriate for that context, and balance the social and technical measures. Essentially, there is no silver bullet. There is no one solution, and we need to remember that there are people and humans involved in these. So I've kind of wrapped up some of the conclusions there. Fire ignition and spread are critical, but we need to also think about the social. We need to think about before, during, and after a fire, and we need collaborative thinking where we can integrate the systems. And essentially, there's much to learn from us all. If you are interested in learning more with us, then we have a community of practice that is specific for people that are working on humanitarian or camp-like settings. Please do join me. I'm hoping that I think we've got Jose lined up to talk at our next meeting. And thank you for your time. I do realise I've spoken a lot, but I hope that you found it useful. And if you've got any questions, please get in touch. Otherwise, I will end the show, and over to you, Mike.
Excellent, thank you. That was a really, really interesting presentation, and I hope that kind of got us all thinking about how we can fit into that space and what role can we play within that. You know, we're all sort of subject matter experts, right, on that fire. So how can we insert ourselves, whether it's from as our fire brigade, whether it's as individual firefighters. I know that we have lots of EMS folks. So how does this relate? If we broaden that out, and all those issues that relate to fire can also relate to the emergency medical. If there's some type of emergency, how do we locate where it's at? How do we gain that access? So lots of great information to think about. I know lots of you all have these settlements within your communities with these same issues, densely packed combustible materials, all that sort of stuff. So really some great information to get us thinking about the subject. I'm going to wrap up today's sort of formal portion of the training, and then we'll open the floor up to questions and things. Big thank you to Helen for coming and sharing what her organization is doing. Really great and eye-opening. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to you all for taking time out of your schedules, for spending your money for the bundles so that you could access our training today. Taking your time to do this to try to better yourselves and your community, better serve your community. We're really appreciative of all that. If you find that this is valuable information and you'd like to share it with others in the community, please feel free to share our link for our registration for these classes. We've got plenty of seats available. So anybody you think that may find this training valuable, please feel free to share those links as well. Thanks to everyone, and I hope to see you all again next week.